Okay, good morning. Thank you very much to Mayor Cohen for sponsoring the light refreshments, and even though he paid GST, but it's part of the effort to.
This was a good week to sponsor.
It was a good. It was yeah. What honor would you like to make the sponsorship? Okay, thank you.
Super Rabbi.
All right, Super Rabbi Lesher man. All right. So this topic this week, is Innocence Lost, a Torah perspective on civilian casualties in war. It's actually one of the most difficult areas of ethical and moral questions and dilemmas, because it's somewhat of a modern question, and there's not that much. There's a lot in the literature in modern times, but if you go back, to wars prior to, let's say, Vietnam, or even before, most wars, I can't say, I don't have the exact historical record, but most wars were fought on a battlefield. You don't have the civilian population embedded, into the actual military zone. You had, in different countries would, they'd take over different areas, but even, let's say, in, Nazi-occupied Poland, they generally were fighting outside of the civilian areas. So this new question of what is a legitimate civilian casualty as part of a war when you have the actual enemy embedded into the civilian population is a very difficult and painful question. And it's one of the questions that has been marshaled, one of the claims that has been marshaled against the IDF on a moral level is that they are killing civilians, as part of their military as part of the military activities, and they've claimed that this is, let's say, disproportionate actions, or they weren't warranted, and this has been going on. I mean, they had in the Goldstone report, there's many iterations of this question. So I want to take a step back, and as we mentioned every week, we want to see what is a Torah perspective on what is considered a collateral damage, which we understand. You try to avoid civilian casualties. You try to, as an army that has a certain level of ethical, moral standard, try to maintain that standard and try to avoid the civilian casualties. What's considered a legitimate military objective that could warrant civilian casualties? What's considered targeting civilians, which is one of the, at least it used to be, a textbook definition of terrorism, but now you have sort of this these vague sort of definitions that are thrown around. And it's hard to really determine what's considered, legitimate military operation that has civilian casualties as a sort of, not intended, but we call it, collateral damage, and what's considered actual targeting of the civilian population, which is not legitimate and is wrong. So how does where do we look for in the Torah to figure out this question? As we'll see, it's a very difficult question to answer. We probably won't come out with a black and white, as we usually don't, but it will be interesting to see how the Mefarshim, how the Torah, how we discuss this in the Sugya, in the sources. So, does anyone want to? Maybe you could take a peek at the source sheet. You'll have a little cheat sheet that you have over there. Anyone want to guess, where do we look at the Torah to determine this question? Where would you go? In this past week's Parsha, that's why I chose this topic. Exactly right, Lawrence. This past week's Parsha, we have a narrative, a story, about the capturing of Dinah. And Dinah was captured by Shechem. And Shimon and Levi go ahead, and you'll see, and we'll read the Psukim together, they go ahead and they wipe out the entire civilian population of Shechem. So, was that the right thing or the wrong thing to do? Were the civilians culpable? Was that considered disproportionate? So how do we understand? So let's take a look at the sources, and let's see if we could try to, in some way, glean from that how, let's say, in the current state of the political debate, how would we side on the general questions of a military that's trying to accomplish certain military objectives when you have the civilian population that is there and is oftentimes being killed. So the Torah tells us in Parshas Vayishlach, the Torah says that after Dinah was captured, and they make up this whole ploy that everyone should get circumcised. And on the third day, which is considered to be the most painful, what did the Shimon and Levi do? The Torah tells us, source number 1, B'nei Yaakov Shimon v'Levi achei Dina, right? Shimon and Levi, Yaakov's two sons, they went ahead, the brother of Dina, Ish Charbo, they took a sword, v'yavo el ha'ir betach, and they came upon the city it says here, this is a translation from Safari, unmolested. I guess it means not encumbered by anything, just very strong. That's why we call, I believe that's the, bitachon is like strength or confidence, and security, right, is called batuach. So they came with strength, v'yahargu kol zachar, and they killed all of the males. Ves Chamor v'Shechem, Chamor and his son Shechem, who was they were the ones who took Dinah. Shechem really liked her, and I guess Chamor arranged it, but they were really the ones behind it. So they killed them. Hargu lefi charev v'yikchu es Dinah. They took Dinah v'Shechem v'yetzeu, and they got out and they took Dinah back home. So I guess Dad got word of this. Can't really go ahead and wipe out an entire city and no one finds out about it. So what happens? Come home. So what'd you do today, sons? Vayomer Yaakov el Shimon v'Levi. Levi, he tells his two sons, Shimon and Levi, Achartem osi lahavisheni b'yoshev aretz b'kanani b'prizi. You have brought me trouble, making me odious amongst the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanim and the Prizim. What is he saying? You placed me in a vulnerable place. You just wiped out a whole city. And it's really, we're living in this land of the Canaanim. We don't have sovereignty, and you've placed me in a vulnerable place. He says, Va'ani, misay mispar, we have very few in number. V'nasvu alai, if they unite against me, v'hikuni v'nishmadati ani uvesi. They would attack, if they unite and attack against me, I would become destroyed. What's their response? Shimon and Levi say, Vayomru, hachezona yasa esa chusenu. But they made us, should they make, like hachezona, it's like a question, hachezona yasa esa chusenu. Are you going to let them make our sister into a prostitute? And to respond to that, Yaakov has no response to that. So anyone want to weigh in and take a stand on what do you think? Was there something morally wrong that Shimon and Levi did?
Yaakov's response doesn't seem to indicate that he has a moral issue with what they were doing.
Correct.
His response was more, this is going to cause trouble for us.
Right. It's a pragmatic concern.
Yeah.
Pragmatic concern. It doesn't look good, but doesn't seem to be anything wrong with what they did. So that's what you would get generally from the Mefarshim on this story in Parshas Vayishlach. In fact, the Rambam in Hilchos Melachim, well, actually, before we get to Rambam in Hilchos Melachim, that's what you would get from the Parshas Vayishlach. Yeah.
Having them all do a bris milah like this is very similar to the pager attack.
To what attack?
Like what Israel did with the pagers.
It's a surprise attack. I mean, what are the...
You bring them... I guess you let down their guard in some way.
Yes.
And you injure them prior to attacking.
Right. Yeah.
To make battle easier.
I hear that. Right. There was no. I don't think the pager was I don't think it was a. At least I don't remember. Was it ever initially given as like a peace move? Like Shimon and Levi organized sort of a. They were doing something that the Shechem thought. Okay. Right. We're going to now create this unified country and we'll marry each other. But it was a weakening beforehand. Yeah.
Are you not allowed to use strategy in order to...
So that's the question. In other words, to fight against the people who took your sister and to get them out seems to be...
By way of deception.
Yeah, by way of deception. Yeah, so deception was definitely Shimon and Levi's initial foray, which seemingly... doesn't seem to be Yaakov doesn't object to it from a moral standpoint. He just says, you place me in a very precarious position. That's what Lawrence is pointing out. And you can see, like Dovi said, the echoes in today's current situation as well. So that's what you get from Parshas Vayishlach. But if you go ahead, move on to Parshas Vayechi, in Parshas Vayechi, all the brothers are getting the brachas, right? They're lining up. Now the people go to Gedolim in Bnei Brak, take a selfie, get a bracha. I'm not saying yes or no, but it's a very popular thing to do. But Yaakov's they're waiting to get the brachas, and Yaakov starts to go ripping into Shimon and Levi. They're expecting to get blessings, and he starts to basically criticize them. And look at the way what he's talking about. This is many years later, right? But Yaakov's is nearing his death, and this is the final message that Yaakov sends to Shimon and Levi. So it obviously has a lot of dramatic effect. This is the final word. Shimon v'Levi achim. Shimon and Levi are brothers. Klei chamas mecherosehem. Their weapons are tools of lawlessness. There's a lot of different translations of these words, but basically, he's criticizing them. Bisodam al tavo nafshi. In their counsel, in their secrets, in their decisions, don't bring my soul should not be brought into that. Bikilam al techad kivodi. In their assembly, do not count my honor with them. Why? Kiva apam hargu ish ubertonam ikrushor. Because in their anger, they killed a man, and they decided with their pleasure to slay or to maim an ox. Arur apam, cursed be their anger. Ki oz ve'evrasam ki kashasa achal kaim bi'akov v'afitzim bi'Yisrael. Their wrath was relentless, and therefore I will divide them out in Yaakov, and I will spread them out in Yisrael. Yaakov clearly is referencing Shimon and Levi's wiping out of Shechem, their annihilation of Shechem. So, whereas in Parshas Vayishlach, Yaakov says nothing with no moral complaint, in Vayechi, many years later, he criticizes them. Now, it's interesting to note that the Rambam in Hilchos Melachim, he actually seems to take the side of Shimon and Levi from a halachic standpoint. What was the rationale for Shimon and Levi to wipe out the entire city of Shechem, not just the people they needed to rescue their daughter? Anyone want to take a guess? Is there any halachic rationale?
Wipe out a city? Here in Innocence?
Didn't that happen with Binyamin? Sheva Binyamin? Where they were almost wiped out?
Pelegish Begiva?
Yeah.
Okay, that we criticized that we shouldn't kill out the whole. I mean, generally the whole story begins with tragedy and ends with tragedy.
What's the question, sir?
Is there any reason that the entire city of Shechem would be morally culpable to the kidnapping of Dinah and be therefore liable to death? So the Rambam in Hilchos Melachim says yes, because they were liable because they didn't set up dinim. One of the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, one of the 7 Noachide commandments is that the non-Jews must appoint or set up either a court or a legal system, the details of which are subject to a lot of debate. Do they set up Choshen Mishpat? How do they set it up? Is it just general law? But just the fact that you could have a country have the leader of its country's son go or the leader of the country's kidnap and rape a woman, and then that nobody says boo. The Rambam says that's a failure of the country to set up a legal system that is just, and therefore they're chayiv misa because Ben Noach, who does not follow any one of the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, is not just it's not just a slap on the wrist. They're chayiv misa. And therefore, the Rambam says in Hilchos Melachim, Perek Tes, Halach Yudal, source number 4, that is why Shimon and Levi were allowed to kill them.
You can say the same thing about Gaza today.
You could make that argument. You could make that argument.
Yeah,
That's why we're talking about this. You could make that argument. Now, the Ramban says a bunch of things in response to this Rambam. The Ramban says, number one, he says, Ein devarim halalu nechonim be'enai. This is in source number 5, the Ramban al Torah, in Parshas Vayishlach. Shem kain. If what the Rambam is saying is true, Haya Yaakov Avinu chayav liyos kohen v'zocha b'misatzam. Yaakov Avinu should have been the first one to give them a yashikoach. When they came home and he said, "What did you do today, sons?" "Well, Daddy, we just wiped out a whole city." What did he say? He said he placed me in a position of precarious position. And later in Parshas Vayechi, he criticizes them. So the Ramban is more focused on the Pshuta Shel Mikra and the narrative in the Torah than the Rambam. The Rambam is telling us a halakhic concept, but the Ramban says, how does that halakhic concept fit with the narrative in the Torah? And this could be another whole shir, which is how do we determine halacha? Do we use halachic concepts, or can we use the narrative in the Torah? That's a whole other question, which we're going to touch a little bit on with a Rav Asher Weiss, but it's a big topic. But the Ramban is saying Yaakov Avinu criticizes Shimon and Levi, so therefore there could not have been this rationale that the Rambam is marshaling of dinim. Then he says, I'll get to you, Josh, in a second. V'im pachad mehem, maybe Yaakov was afraid of the people. In other words, like he said, what are you doing? This is not smart to go and wipe out this people. Maybe he was afraid of them. So why later in Parshas Vayechi does he hold on to this? It's the final comment that he tells them many years later, where it was not a concern that he was going to be, he wasn't, in a precarious situation then, and he still criticizes the children of Shimon and Levi for doing what they did. And then he punishes them. Not only does he criticize them, he punishes them. He says that we're going to spread them throughout the people of Israel. And again, like he said, why did he do, like we mentioned, why would he be critical if they were actually in the right for doing what they did? Yes, Josh?
So I was just going to say, another point against Rambam is discounting the rape, right? If we say that the actual issue is that taking without a court, right, and allowing kidnapping to happen, this is the fourth time that someone related to between Sarah and Rivka, this is the fourth time that someone
kidnapped,
taken, right? Like between Gerar and Mitzrayim, and I mean we don't see those kinds of punishments being meted out to either of those civilizations, right?
Could say that it was not possible, right? What's Avram going to do?
I mean, Avram destroyed. I mean,
he was involved in military. I hear what you're saying.
A kingdom.
I hear.
Right?
Okay. Right. That's another good question. How did they know about this? It's nice to have a concept in our Torah, but when were they given these mitzvos? The Gemara derives them from Sukkim, in the Torah,
and clearly kidnapping and rape was a weapon of war, or a domination of one tribe
right.
over another.
It was definitely done in those days in the ancient world, and this is something which the Ramban says. I think it's on Hamas, where it talks about not Hamas, but Hamas in Parshas Noach, that he makes the argument similar to what you're addressing, which is that there was no actual formal revelation or anything like that, but it was a mitzvah sichlius, like the people of the Mabul should have known from their own moral compass that what they're doing is wrong. But I think what Dovi's pointing out is that this was sort of acceptable on some level in the society in which they lived. So it's hard to know, I don't know, Avram and Achai, Avodah Zarah, everyone was paid, they were all serving idols. So it's like they're living in a pagan society, so everyone, you could kill anybody? Because they're, so I don't, it's a good question, but that's the Ramban, the Rambam says, and the Ramban says that doesn't fit with the narrative, and Josh's point, also interesting, I didn't think of this, is that there's precedent. There is precedent that we don't wipe out all people based on the actions of the leader, which we're going to maybe have an answer to that from a Maharal, which we're going to get up to if we have time, which I think we will. Yes, Chaim.
Does the Torah
Or is it okay if I call you the Maggid, or is this?
He prefers that, actually.
I prefer that.
Does the Torah allude to, or does Chazal allude to the fact that if you know someone's going to come to kill you,
Yeah.
I'd like to kill him first. Meaning,
Habal lahargacha, hashkim lahargit. Yeah. You're allowed to. Yes, that's a case of Rodef. Here, we're dealing with, at least you could make the argument they weren't innocent civilians, which we may get to in a second. But just on the face of it, the story in the Torah is you have the government or whatever, the dictatorship, Shechem and Hamor, his father. And then you have the peasants. The peasants were not involved in this decision. They didn't really care. They didn't benefit from kidnapping Dinah. And Shimon and Levi go out and kill out all the males. who didn't. It's not like they were involved or they were trying to kill anybody. They just and it wasn't just their escape route, like killing anyone in their way. They went ahead and they murdered all the people because after they had their bris milah, they were weak, and they, you could call it a preemptive strike if you may. Maybe you could argue that they knew that if they took Dinah back, then Shechem would attack them, so they did a preemptive strike. But on the face of it, it seems like Yaakov is criticizing them morally in Parshas Vayechi, which is the Ramban's point, and the Rambam saying halachically Shimon and Levi were in the right because they didn't set up a legal system.
But in those days, the legal system was constantly
Legal system,
overridden by-
Shmigal system, like what do you... Okay, so very good. So that's what the Maharal is about to say. Very good, Gabi. So we're now perfectly poised to move on to the third approach in the Rishon. Maharal sort of on the Achron side, but in the... I guess he's one of the early Achronim. Source number 6. The Gur Aryeh, which is a commentary on Rashi, written by the Maharal. And the Maharal has a third approach. And he says as follows. He quotes the Rambam, then he quotes the Ramban, and he says the following. Actually, he just quotes the Rambam, and then he says, look at source number 6. Ube'emes davar tema heim elu advarim. What the Rambam says is doesn't make any sense. Why? Ki eich efshar lahem ladon as ben nasi haaretz. Ki hayu yireim mehem. This is what Gabi was saying. 1 second. What are they supposed to be doing in the people of Shechem? They're supposed to go and picket outside, with signs and loudspeakers, and tell Shechem, you terrible Ben Nasi, you terrible son of the leader, you should have done what you did. The guy, what do you mean? They would go ahead and either throw them all in jail or kill them. We're talking about a dictatorship. We're talking about ancient Mesopotamia. It's not like a democracy where you could have freedom of speech. Like this is what do you expect from them? So he says, even though, like the Rambam says, that they were chayiv in dinim to set up courts, but we have another concept in halacha of called ones rachmana patre. The Torah doesn't obligate you when it's not within your frame of choice. It's not within your parameters of choice, and therefore, how were the people of Shechem supposed to enforce this law of dinim? So the Maharal gives a different approach to the whole story to explain why Shimon and Levi were allowed to do what they did, and this is going to be the focus of much of the later rabbinic literature about the morality and the ethical rationale, potentially, of the IDFs in engaging in wars in civilian populations with civilian casualties. Take a look at what he says. He says, whenever you have two nations fighting against each other, and it's considered wartime, he says, first of all, the Torah says you have to open with peace. It says you have to be poskim b'shalom. However, he says, Hainu hichi delo asul Yisrael davar. That's only if the Jewish people are involved in a war or in some sort of it's actually not in a war. There was nothing done. There was no attack prior to it. They have to open with peace and offer peace. However, al hichi to asul Yisrael davar. But let's say the enemy nation attacked the Jewish people. Like this case where they took Dinah and they kidnapped her unprovoked. Even though it was only one of them, since, like he said, there are two nations fighting against each other, this individual is from this nation. You're allowed to go and take revenge, exercise justice on the nation as a whole. Because now, and he says this is true, Haim Kol HaMilchamos, this is true for all war. When you're engaged in a war, then you have two nations fighting against each other, and anyone that's part of that nation, you can exercise justice and he says nikmasam, revenge on those people. So what the Maharal is basically saying is that wartime is different, and since you could really in our parlance, in our modern parlance, you could say Shechem sort of used an act of or a declaration of war. They utilized a declaration of war when they went ahead and they attacked or they breached the peace. They broke the peace by kidnapping Dinah, and therefore the entire city of Shechem became what's halakhically considered a shas milchama. They were at war with the Jewish people, and therefore all citizens of Shechem were considered culpable by the very fact that they were part of the people of Shechem. And this Maharal is very often quoted in support of not being concerned with civilian casualties when Israel is at war. Many posts can point out that, yes, it could be a good idea, but it's not required to make, let's say, there are certain military operations that you could have two options. One option is you can, protect your own soldiers by doing, let's say, an airstrike. An airstrike generally is less, casualties on the military, from the military. Besides, as opposed to going in a ground offense, but it's going to probably result in more civilian casualties on the enemy side. So the poskim say, well, you see, the Maharal says once you're in a wartime, once you're involved in a shas milchama, then even the people who are not engaged in the actual war, they're civilians, they're also part of this nation, and therefore they are able to be attacked. Now, does anyone want to offer a rebuttal to this source? What would be a rebuttal to this, using this Maharal to justify not taking civilian casualties into consideration? Like I mentioned, if you choose option one, which is an airstrike, you actually generally save, at least in that operation, you save more of your own soldiers' lives. If you go in a ground offensive, you could be sacrificing your own soldiers for the value of minimizing civilian casualties of the enemy. So it's a real moral dilemma. It's not like they're not equal choices, right? One is actually very costly on your side, but it is morally a question. So anyone want to? So the Maharal is utilized in some poskim, modern day poskim, to say you don't need to consider the other side's civilian casualties because to begin with, they are considered part of this nation that you're at war with, and when it's at war, you can attack any of the people that are part of that nation. Anyone want to offer a rebuttal?
Yeah, I like it.
You like it?
I like it too.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Makes sense. So one issue with using the source. Yeah, Dovi?
So it's interesting, like in the legal sphere today, there's this concept of proportionality.
Yes.
Which does not mean that if someone hits you with a 500-pound bomb, you're only allowed to hit them with a 500-pound bomb.
Right, it doesn't mean that, right.
But it does mean that your response should be proportional to the military objectives that you're trying to achieve.
Correct. That is a very important point that I feel like many people don't understand.
Right.
Yes.
But in this context, right, so like, for example, today, my cousin's an anesthesiologist in IDF. He was telling me that, so there's 800 soldiers that have been killed, but another 12,000 have been injured.
Yes.
Right? For the purpose of minimizing essentially civilian death. But then the question is, from a proportionality perspective, when you are blowing up a target, are you doing it like if the target is to do X, are you I'm trying to find the right words. Is it over, the amount of civilian deaths you're going to cause over and above the objective that you're trying to achieve? It's like a minor objective. You're going to kill 1,000 people around it. Is that worth it relative to the objective? So if the objective is to win the war, and you can win the war with this one strike, maybe it's worth it to kill 1,000 civilians.
Yeah.
But if it's a minor target that's not going to actually achieve anything major, maybe 1,000 civilians is too much.
It's very hard to determine the proportionality, yes.
But going back to Yaakov's comment, maybe it's almost like a hasbara thing, meaning
yes,
right? You have to worry about you have to live with these people eventually, right? You want Hashem's name to be positive in the world, and that proportionality there is an impact of proportionality, meaning that if you wanton killing of civilians, that yes, maybe technically you're allowed to, but is it a good idea? In the broader scheme of things.
Right, so there's three areas that Dovi's touching on, very important points. Number one, the whole the way that the media spins the proportionality argument is numbers. Oh, they killed this many, we killed this many. That's not what proportionality means in the legal and ethical, think tanks or the ethicists of the world. The proportionality means if you have a particular military objective, then proportional to that objective, there are certain criteria that it has to reach, but then you're justified in killing a certain amount of civilians, which in and of itself is hard to determine. Like, let's say your objective is a totally 100% kosher military objective, but it's not a major objective. It's like Jovi was saying, it's a minor. So how much is that? These are very gray areas. But and then the other point
idea is that you're trying to avoid wanton slaughter, just for the sake of it.
And then right. And then the question is, even if it's justified on a moral level, is it wise to do from a, let's say, geopolitical perspective? You have to consider that as well.
Rabbi, just one last thing. But then you have the element of
You could do more than just one question.
civilians.
Yes.
Right?
How do you define a civilian?
How do you define civilian?
Correct.
You see in Gaza,
Yes.
civilians
It's very hard to determine.
are harboring
Yes.
hostages.
Right, but
Doctors
let's say you
and
have
teachers.
Let's
and
say you have
families,
you have
but they're
children,
civilians.
you have babies, you have children. Let's just
Yeah.
we could keep it under the age of 10. It's hard to really. These are all ambiguous definitions. Let's just, for argument's sake, there's such a thing as a civilian.
Hold on, sorry.
Yeah.
Just to get a little bit, maybe a little bit
Yeah.
controversial. A father goes up. He's one of the guys who crossed the line October 7th.
Yeah.
He comes back. His 6-year-old son.
Right.
He's a civilian.
Right.
But his father was one of the guys. So does he? I don't know.
It's very difficult to determine.
Right?
Let's just say, from argument's sake, we have certain definition. Whatever that determines in nation is going to be, but it's a very good point. We're going to have a distinction between a civilian and a military. I'm sure the IDF has certain criteria of who's considered a civilian, but it's a good point. It's hard to even know that. For sure,
in
someone
my
who
opinion-
is carrying a weapon is not a
In
civilian.
my opinion,
Yes.
If a member of the family goes and carries out an attack, he's putting his entire family at risk. They're all considered one. Sorry.
Would you say this? I'm not in any way
Yeah.
advocating this. I'm just, for the argument's sake. Would you say the opposite? If you have a family where the father is an Israeli soldier fighting in Gaza, does that put his family at risk? I don't think so.
No.
Because they're civilians. They don't. So it's it's a very morally difficult question. I'm just pointing it out. But what I was going to say, yeah.
You can't compare an Israeli soldier to a terrorist that's coming.
Because they're targeting civilians. That's the
But we're not
definition.
talking about Gaza, we're talking about like a war with Egypt or
Yeah.
war with Syria,
I see.
when a soldier in the Syrian army or in the Egyptian army, their whole family is considered a target.
I mean,
I see.
any
So I
military
would
has
say
this
no.
problem.
I would say no to
That's
that.
different.
I would say no to
Because
that.
they have a clear
I would say no to
line
that.
between active military and civilian population.
Correct.
It's very difficult when you have a civilian population that the military is embedded in. It's even using these words as military and civilian.
I'm saying it's not a military embedded in a civilian population.
It's
It's terrorists in a civilian population.
Terrorists,
which
right.
has its own.
Sure,
unique
terrorists embedded in a civilian population. Are there civilians in Gaza that are innocent? I think we could all agree there are. How do we define them? Very difficult. I don't know. But now we're talking about, let's say, even those people. The Maharal is advocating that we don't have to consider them either. Even those people. Whatever they are, that they're innocent, he's saying you don't have to worry about them. You can take care of your military objective. So one rebuttal to this in the postskim, again, this is a sugya. It's very difficult to really come out with a black and white, but we'll try. We have 8 more minutes. One of the rebuttals in the sugya is this is not a halachic source. This is a parish in a story in the Torah, right? There are different. We give weight to different things in our Masorah in different ways. In our tradition, we have Shulchan Aruch, we have Choshen Mishpah, right? Those are weighty. There's halachic a medrash or a story in the Torah or a parish on a story in the Torah doesn't have as much halachic weight. So Rav Asher Weiss points this out in one of his in Minchas Asher in Sefer Dvarim, and he says there's no halachic source other than these perushim of Tanakh, and he goes on and he quotes the Maharal, etc. I heard from a very reliable source who heard from someone who's also a reliable source that Rav Shlomo Fisher, who was a great Talmud Chacham in Eretz Yisrael, is no longer living. He was told that Rav Asher Weiss made this point and that there was no halachic source other than this Maharal. And he says, what are you talking about? We have a Tosas in Avodah Zarah. The Tosas in Avodah Zarah quotes a Yerushalmi and a Maseches Sofrim, which has a line in that Maseches Sofrim, it's one of the Masechta Ketanos in source number 7, that it says, HaKosher Shabagoyim, even the best of the non-Jews, Chaim, totally innocent, we call them an upstanding citizen, even them, b'shas milchama harug. At a time of war, they are killed. So Rav Shlomo Fisher says, what's Rav Asher Weiss saying? Oh, there's no halachic source. We have a foolish, explicit Tosus and Avodah Zarah, which, as we say, has a very strong weight in halacha. The Gur Aryeh, a comment to the Maharal on a Rashi in the Parsha of Yishlach, not as weighty a source. Rav Neria Gutel and other poskim say, whoa, 1 second. Even this source is also not a halachic source, because if you look at the context of the other comments in Mesechah Sofrim, they're not halachic prescriptions. They're they're descriptions. For example, you may have heard of this. It comes up in the Gemara in other places. Tov shibarofim l'gehenim. The best doctors go to hell. What does that mean? For another time. But it's certain lessons, certain moral thing. If doctors, some explain, they think that they have specific way to heal people, not through godly means. Whatever. It's hard to really these are loaded comments, but other things maybe not as loaded. That hachamarim ruban rishayin. Most donkey drivers are evil. Anyone here a donkey driver? Hopefully not. Hasifanim ruban tzadikin. Most sailors are righteous. Anyone here a sailor? The point is, these are not halachos. These are describing certain trends or certain lessons which we don't have time to go into. So Rav Neria Gutel says, this is also not a halachic source. So you have no Maharal, you have no Tosus in Avodah Zarah. And that really leaves us wondering if we can use these sources at all. Another argument in the poskim to suggest not utilizing this argument that you can just kill civilians as part of this people is without considering them, is there are poskim that point out that there's something called the Geneva Convention. The Geneva Convention, without going into all the details, it has certain rules of what's considered genocide, what's considered not genocide, and there's been different conventions and understood. I think that they don't invite Israel to it. Whatever it is, there's issues with the Geneva Convention that have been brought up by ethicists. But just even assuming that there is some sort of world standard, which again you could even challenge this, but let's say there is a world standard in what is considered militarily ethical or not ethical, what's considered actions that are against some sort of enemy that is military or that are not considered genocidal, and there are those that are more. I guess genocidal is the wrong word, but even crimes against humanity. There are those that suggest that even if the Geneva Convention is going further than the halacha goes, but we may be bound by it. Because the Rambam in Hilchos Melachim, another Rambam, he says that at the time of the Givonim, the Jewish people made a bris with the Givonim that was against the Torah, and we still had to follow it. We still had to follow the bris that was made with the Givonim. So, even if you take the Maharal as halacha, which we said before, it's not necessarily halacha. Even if you take the Tosas and Avodah Zarah and you go with this, Rav Shlomo Fisher, that it's halacha, there are those that say that Rav Shaul Yisraeli and Rav Neria Gutel say that the state of Israel is required to follow specifically the Fourth Geneva Convention, which requires a military to consider the civilian casualties that are incurred by the enemy side and allow for collateral damage, but cannot target or whatever. There's a lot of conditions to it, but basically they have to consider their military objectives and take into account the civilian population. So that's another argument. Is that agreed upon by all the poskim? Definitely not. Do we have a consensus on this question? I would say probably not. How do we understand this? So it's a dispute. It's a dispute amongst the poskim. Rav Asher Weiss says that you can, as long as you're taking military objective, you're not just targeting civilians, like we said, is terrorism. There's a military objective. You don't have to consider the civilian population. Others say that maybe you do, as we mentioned, because of the Geneva Convention. Maybe there's another factor, which Dovi pointed out, which is the general optics and the general geopolitical situation, and maybe that's also going to be eventually could put people at risk, because if we lose certain support from other countries, or we lose certain treaties because if we break those rules or we break those agreements, then maybe we'll have less funding. There's all these different political considerations. I'm going to finish with one last comment of Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, who wrote. Two more things. Rav Aaron Lichtenstein wrote an article in 1973. Which I think is an important thing to bear in mind. He says, this is source number 10. Anytime we discuss this question of civilian casualties, or generally moral questions in war, he says one has to remember, ulam chashuv bioter. It's very important, or most important, shahadam hayotzi l'milchama, that a person who goes out to war, yada, he knows, she'ein hu over me'olam baal sulam arachim echad, that he's not going from one world with a set of values, le'olam baal sulam arachim shona, to going into a different world that has a different set of values. Adam echad v'uma achat. It's one person, one nation. Einam yicholim lehispatzel l'shnayim. A person cannot be split into two, and say, well, there's sort of the regular morality of life, and then there's war and everything goes. He says, no.
I think that's the proportionality argument.
Maybe that's it.
You still have
to consider
have some kind of moral compass and consider your actions.
Yes.
Not just and kill everything.
There is, and it's the same, and what he's arguing is, it's the same morality. It may have different applications, but it's the same set of values. And he says that's very important for people who are fighting. The first number one set priority for anyone in all situations, Ya'amud HaShalom, is the principle of peace. And he quotes a medrash that Shalom is connected everything, and therefore even if the application of the value of peace is then leading to fighting and potentially even having civilians die, we can't forget why we're doing this. We can't think that it's a moral bankruptcy, that anything goes. He says, no, it's the same set of values, maybe have different applications, but one has to know it's the same set of values. And I'll just finish with one last article, which was written a number of years ago by Rabbi Yitzchak Blau in Tradition. And he says, I think an important caveat, but then he finishes with I think a very important point. He says, in general, we should distinguish between our international posture, this is what Dovi was saying, and our internal posture. On the international front, we can continue to emphasize the hypocrisy of those who constantly criticize Israel while turning a blind eye to the many dictators, tyrants, and human rights abusers around the globe. Furthermore, we will not allow our critics to force us to set up an ethical standard of such difficulty that elementary self-defense becomes impossible. Right? People say, you have to ceasefire, and then the argument opposing that is, well, how can we ever finish this? How can we ever succeed at setting up self-defense if we're always supposed to have a ceasefire a moment after we begin the military action? Yet, he says, our internal discussions dare not cease from asking ethical questions. The corruption of a society that comes in wartime receives eloquent expression in our sources. Part of avoiding this corruption, as we know, right, David HaMelech was told he can't build the Beis HaMikdash, even though the wars he engaged with were legitimate, but he wasn't allowed to build the Beis HaMikdash. He quotes a number of other things. Part of avoiding this corruption entails not treating war as a time of ethical anarchy. We have seen that many of our traditional sources were concerned that we attempt to spare enemy innocence. We have found sources that teach this principle directly without even mentioning broader ethical commandments, etc. Then I think he finishes off with a very important last two sentences. I will not be so presumptuous as to try to demarcate the exact lines as to the precise degree that this concern factors into the wartime strategy, as we mentioned, the concern for civilian casualties. However, I am convinced that it must be a factor. In other words, we must factor it in. How we do, he says, I can't really tell you. But the fact that we have to ask this question internally, it's an internal posture. We have to ask this question internally. Externally, from the international point of view, we can point out the hypocrisy. You're saying that Israel has to do X, Y, and Z, but other countries can go ahead and you haven't criticized them at all. That we can do on a sort of an external posture, but our internal posture, what we have to talk about is making sure that we maintain a sort of an ethical high ground, and making sure that we as Rav Aaron Lichtenstein said, recognize that we have the same set of moral values. It may have different expression. It may have we may have to go to war in certain self-defense situations, but we can't forget that we are fighting to maintain peace to finally reach that objective, and we can't forget that we have this. We have a moral standard. We have the Torah. We have our ethical morality, and we can't forget that. So that's the final word that I will share, but it's really a very difficult question to answer. As we noted, it's very gray and difficult to determine, but we got a chance to take a look at the sources, and you can feel free to follow up, and now you are more geared and more informed on how to look at current events, but I can't answer which particular compass to what the compass tells us. We know we have a moral compass, but I can't necessarily answer the question for you. But thank you everyone for coming, and Yasher Koach. We'll continue next week. Emir Tashem. Right next week we're on.